you just witnessed was Puddle of Mud's cover of About a Girl by Nirvana, widely considered to be one of the most botched attempts at a cover song of all time. Your immediate reaction to that might have been, how in the world does such a poorly conceived cover even happen in the first place? Well, there's actually a lot of factors that go into what can make a cover great or make it completely miss the mark, and that's what I'm going to lecture you about today. I know you didn't ask for it, but here's Before we really get into it, you might be wondering what my qualifications are to talk about a topic like this because you've never heard of me before. Well, I've been reviewing and covering underground and indie music on TikTok and Instagram for a while now, and I was also a choir singer for about 8 years. Which I guess doesn't really qualify me to talk about this, but I want to, so I'm gonna do it anyways. Anyways, the idea of the cover song, at least in American music, stems from the oral traditions of indigenous people and plantation work songs. These songs generally didn't have any actual written down words or music, and instead were passed down by word of mouth to whoever was going to perform them next. This practice led to a lot of early American music either not having a clear author or not having any real standard for their performance. These main cultures and traditions evolved into what we know today as traditional American folk music. Folk music carries a lot of elements of those oral traditions, specifically the sharing of song and performance that makes songs lose clear ownership and not really have super strict performance guidelines. So essentially, you could say that American folk music is a genre that was born from the cover. Also, real quick, it's important to note that a lot of folk music that has been brought into the American canon was actually brought over by immigrants, such as songs like Danny Boy or Whiskey in a Jar, so we can't forget those people's involvement in bringing music to where it is today. That includes giving a lot of gratitude to indigenous people and African Americans who helped build the tradition as well. Fast forwarding quite a bit through history, we have folk music evolving into blues, evolving into rock and roll, and evolving into pop. Each musical evolution gained its own definitive musical elements and also further structured the idea of ownership over songs and strict performance guidelines. So now we're left with modern music, which usually has clear ownership and definitive performances. Covers become less common and instead now are born out of the idea of admiration, to wanting to replicate whatever the tone, message, or feeling of the original song was. Without getting into legal jargon or boring copyright law. Basically, all we need to know now is that covers are usually born out of admiration instead of sharing. Even most folk music today has some kind of definitive version that most people can point at to say that's what the song is supposed to sound like. I'm sure I could find a source or something to prove that what I'm saying is actually true, but instead we can just look at other genres of music that don't really have covers to at least prove a little bit of what I'm saying. I'm pretty sure Adam Neely has a video that's going to go into a lot more detail than I'm going to right here, but hip-hop is a genre that generally lacks covers. This is because hip-hop artists generally maintain ownership and prestige over their lyrics and their flows, essentially making their bars individual things that they own instead of being musical elements in their tracks. I know I'm white as a ghost, but I'm pretty sure that this is why remixes are more common in hip-hop, where the beats are changed while the lyrics are usually the original performance or the original artist is brought back to just redo them. And now, with a fuck ton of preamble out of the way so that we can understand why covers mostly exist in rock and pop music today, we can move on to the Hi. I'm in a different place now, but don't worry about it. What you should be worried about is this thing behind me. This is a 3-point spectrum that I filled out with what I believe to be the 3 main types of covers. I'm going to detail what each of these mean, and then I'm going to go back and I'm going to give an example of how covers can or can't work in these styles. I'm also going to provide some supplemental reading with other positive and negative examples, but I just won't go into as much detail about those. Sound good? If not, bye, I guess, but for the rest of you, let's get cracking. Our first point all the way here on the left are going to be covers that make little to no change to the source material. This may include things like small changes in instrumentation, rhythm, or aspects of the performance, but generally it's going to be pretty faithful to the source material. An easy baseline example I can give you of this is something like Neck Deep's cover of Welcome to Paradise by Green Day. In the middle, we have covers that make substantial changes to the source material, but still retain the same tone and messaging as the original. These kinds of covers might change the genre, make intense changes to the rhythm, instrumentation or tempo, or even extreme differences in aspects of the performance. An easy example of this kind of cover is going to be Rufus Wainwright's cover of Hallelujah by Leonard Cohen. Lastly, all the way here on the right, we're going to have covers that completely reimagine the source material. Opposed to the other two, these covers actually aim to change the feeling or tone of the original. These are almost always going to involve some intense change in tone, rhythm, melody, or even playing in a substantially different genre that may be pretty incongruous sounding to the original. Some might even go as far as changing some of the lyrics to better fit whatever the new messaging is. Honestly, an easy example here is just going to be basically any Weird Al parody song. So at first you might be looking at these categories like fucking duh, right? Songs can either do nothing, a little, or a lot to change a song. But once we start to go into some detail on why these can or can't work, we're going to find a lot of different aspects that go into cover songs, so you can see why something as horrible as Puddle of Mud's cover of About a Girl can even happen in the first place. Time to start on our first category, which is going to be... In the grand scheme of things, most covers are going to end up falling into this category. Cover bands and artists who make their career out of making covers generally try to maintain a high level of faithfulness when they're creating their performances. The main issue that arises here is that when you're not adding a lot of your own musical flair to a song, your actual musical performance needs to be incredibly strong to not be shitty in comparison to the original. This leaves a lot of covers in this category needing to have
impeccable musical performances
to not seem bad or just pointless. Mediocrity honestly runs pretty rampant in this category, so finding examples that are incredibly good or incredibly bad are pretty rare, but we're going to start things off with a really positive example. Our main example on how a cover that does little to no change can be done well is Dear Nora's cover of Girl from the North Country by Bob Dylan. This cover is a perfect example on how to make a faithful recreation of an original while adding just enough small musical elements of your own to add to the work instead of making it worse. This cover maintains basically all of the original musical elements, but the main thing added is this incredibly fuzzy and warm lo-fi quality to the voice and guitar performance that turns this from like a dusty folk song from Dylan
if you're traveling in the North Country Fair
into something incredibly warm and tender.
If you're traveling in the North Country.
It gives the vibes of like a nice, warm, burning fireplace. Honestly, in my opinion, I think Dear Nora's version adds a higher level of that longing sentimentality that's pretty well translated in the lyrics, so this is a pretty good rival to Dylan's original. Other positive examples of songs that make little to no change are Denzel Curry's cover of Bulls on Parade by Rage Against the Machine. Curry's full commitment to the rage and intensity of his performance keeps that feeling of the original while somehow adding even more fire. Joan Baez's cover of Eleanor Rigby by the Beatles. This song already has the lyricism and pace of a good folk song, so Joan Baez brings down the energy and lowers the musical complexity to give it that folk feeling that was lying underneath the surface in the original. Our last positive example is Michael Cera's cover of Clay Pigeons by Blaze Foley. Cera recreates the loneliness and solidarity of Foley's original by using voice effects and washed out production that make up for Cera's lack of country smokiness and stoicism. And now for the bad. Like, really bad. This first one's really bad. Honestly, it's kind of low-hanging fruit, but it does happen to just be a perfect example of how this can go wrong. So, here it is. Machine Gun Kelly's cover of Misery Business by Paramore. This cover is just horrendous. Outstandingly so. Misery Business is an all-time great pop punk song that is crowned by that amazing vocal performance from Hayley Williams, and MGK fucking ruins it with his flat, monotone, and boring ass voice. Genuinely, all you need to do is listen to the delivery of this line versus this line. And I could stop here because that's pretty much all you need to hear to be able to know how horrible the vocal performance of this cover is. MGK just kind of shot himself in the foot by attempting this because he lacks the vocal talent and overall musical ability to do this classic song any justice. I don't really know how he could have made this good, but it definitely wasn't by doing that. Some other poor examples of covers that make minimal changes include Smash Mouth's cover of I'm a Believer by the Monkees. This honestly would have worked pretty well if they were allowed to take a few steps back from that peppy 60s style of rock and roll, because it would fit Steve Harwell's voice just so much better. 5 Seconds of Summer's cover of American Idiot by Green Day. It just lacks all of the sarcastic and satirical undertones of the original. It sounds like they were given the lyrics and the notes and they just memorized them and regurgitated them. And last but certainly not least is Puddle of Mudd's cover of About a Girl by Nirvana. As I said earlier, this is just a horrific example of poor musical performance. The musical skill, or at least the musical audacity that it takes to try to make large changes to an original song, I think limits anything from this point on to basically experienced artists and bands. Which in turn can make it just so fucking funny when a band tries to do something substantial and they just flop horribly. Problems in this category tend to arise when the proposed changes to the original song just aren't executed well or are incredibly incongruous to the original's tone and feeling. This does mean that the cover as a piece of music might be good, but as a cover trying to portray the feeling of the original, it's shit. Our first outstanding example of this category is going to be Tiffany's cover of I Think We're Alone Now by James and the Shandels. This sweet and sentimental track, remixed from a song that was originally done in that peppy 60s rock and roll style, is probably one of the most famous examples of a cover that makes substantial changes and succeeds. This track is an amazing combination of genuinely great musical talent and brilliant execution of taking the lyrics and feeling of this song and translating them into a different genre. The lyrics do work really well for a peppy rock song, but some genius realized that they would be so sweet and sentimental on like a teenage pop love song. One of those like schmaltzy clickbait articles called Covers That Are Better Than the Original is probably bound to have this one on it, and I would agree. Some other good examples of covers that make positive changes are Strokes and Friends cover of Mercy Mercy Me by Marvin Gaye. This cover does lack some of the groove and flow of the original, but I think the grungy and brooding sound actually adds to the song's environmental messaging. Next, Dillard and Clark's cover of Don't Let Me Down by the Beatles. This is another Beatles song that was just waiting to be performed as a soft and smoky country song, and Dillard and Clark really hit the nail on the head. Last and certainly not least is Ska 2 Network and Jeff Rosenstock's cover of A-Punk by Vampire Weekend. A-Punk's rhythm and energy already lends itself pretty easily to ska music, and Ska 2 Network and Jeff Rosenstock just give amazing performances on top of that. Now, before we go on to these negative examples, I just want to say most of them aren't particularly horrible or heinous or anything. Most of them just don't make changes that are positive when you compare it to the original. Starting us off is Fall Out Boy's cover of Beat It by Michael Jackson. I think this just has to be a case of high levels of admiration, plus the band's technical ability to make vocal and instrument performances that are good, because Patrick Stump sure can sing and that band sure can play. But man, this cover just lacks so much of the stuff that made Beat It one of the most famous singles of all time. The thing about Patrick Stump's vocal style is that it's just so theatrical and intense. That kind of style makes it lack a lot of the small movements and intricacies that make Beat It's original performance so complex and masterful. Patrick is basically just belting the entire song. Also, not to mention the fact that this song is just mixed so loudly. The guitars, drums, and vocals are just fucking blasting the entire time. It straight up ruins one of the best parts of Beat It, which was the introduction of the guitar solo, which drastically changed the energy and the volume of the entire song. Other poor examples of covers that make substantial changes are Animal Ant Farm's cover of Smooth Criminal by Michael Jackson. Look, this is a classic cover, sure, but we have to admit that the genre and performance are so hilariously out of place for this song that it's a lot more of an ironic listen than like a real critical one. MXPX's cover of 500 Miles by the Reclaimers. I really like MXPX, but wow. Whoa, this cover's bad. It's honestly just really cheesy and lame and lacks a lot of the geeky charm of the original. Lastly, we have Car Seat Headrest's cover of Running Up That Hill by Kate Bush. This came out before Stranger Things, by the way. It's boring. The original is so full of character and energy, but this cover is boring. This is the final frontier of covers, the point of no creative return. Things don't get much more artistically liberating or difficult than trying to take something that already exists and turning it into something entirely different. It's really not all that common that something like this even happens, so when it does, it can either be a monumentous success or a horrible failure. Honestly, one of the make or break things here is if the original song even has the capacity to be told in a different way. Creative people can find creative ways to tell a story in a way that you wouldn't originally imagine, but honestly, not everything just can be so easily changed. If you have to force something to sound different, it's gonna sound forced and bad. Also, you may have noticed that this is the only section that doesn't have 4 examples. We'll get to that. My favorite example of this kind of thing going really well is Phoebe Bridgers' cover of Nothing Else Matters by Metallica. Nothing Else Matters is already a pretty substantial step back in terms of energy from Metallica's usual work, but Phoebe takes that from 1 to 100 to turn this song into an incredibly soft and heartbreaking piano ballad. Turning one of the most iconic thrash songs of all time into a piano ballad, she's a genius, boy. Phoebe obviously deserves a ton of the credit here, but she's lucky that Nothing Else Matters already had lyrics filled with the kinds of emotions that she usually sings about anyways. She's really smart and took advantage of that to make an amazing cover. Other good examples of completely reimagined covers are basically every Weird Al song, but my personal favorite is The Saga Begins, a cover of Don McLean's American Pie. It uses the sprawling storytelling and music of the original to recount the events of Star Wars: The Phantom Menace. Next is another classic. This is Johnny Cash's cover of Hurt by 9 Inch Nails. This is, and I can say it with a high amount of certainty, probably the most famous modern example of a cover being reimagined. So much so that Trent Reznor basically said that this is Johnny Cash's song now. All right, this one might be a hot take, but I'm honestly a fan of Cake's cover of I Will Survive by Gloria Gaynor. It might just be that I'm pretty partial to that geek rock sound that Cake has, but I think that sarcastic edge they add with their style makes the lyrics still poignant, but in a different way. This is the moment I've been dreading. The moment that I have to talk about one of the worst, most tasteless covers of all time. I'm lying. I'm actually really excited to talk about it. So let's delve into the catastrophe that is Disturbed's cover of The Sound of Silence by Simon and Garfunkel. Hi, this is Editing Michael from the future. I forgot to mention this, but I know Paul Simon endorsed this cover and says that he likes it, but art is subjective and I don't like it, and it's just my opinion, so I'm still going to talk about why I think it's bad. Okay, look. I am a man who was alive during the 2000s, so I can say that in some point of my life, I was a big Disturbed fan. Nu metal isn't much in my rotation these days, but I usually don't have a reason to look down on Disturbed for anyway. Until now. They simply ruined this song by misunderstanding everything that makes the original such a classic. The Sound of Silence is a song that works because of its amazing atmosphere and masterful storytelling. The incredibly intimate harmonies, the distant and somber acoustic guitar, and the growth from a soft piano to a loud climax, like a final cry for help through the chokingness of solidarity and isolation and loneliness. It's one of the best songs ever made. And here's how Disturbed ruined it.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
Before we even get to the vocals, we need to see how poorly butchered the music is. Simon & Garfunkel's original is very sonically simple. A simple guitar line, further accompaniment of guitars later in the track, and a simple bass line. This sonic simplicity allows the track to stay grounded so that the messaging remains incredibly poignant and haunting. If the music was too complicated, the atmosphere would fall apart. Disturbed decided that they wanted this track to be two things: loud and dramatic. Two things that the original song notably isn't. Even though Disturbed's version starts with this simple piano line, it is mixed so loudly and washed with this echoey reverb. For some reason, they decided to go with this shitty keyboard sound for the piano instead of using a real piano, which honestly might have provided some good atmosphere. Unfortunately, the introduction of the guitar line in Disturbed's version doesn't make the song any better. It's again mixed so loudly and so upfront that it feels like somebody is plucking the strings of the guitar directly in front of your ear. The original started with very quiet guitars to embrace that empty feeling and slowly grew in volume to build tension. When you start this built up, there's nothing to build to, so you have no direction. These huge swells of orchestral strings come in around the same time, the vocals come into these high belts, and this is around the time where the song just could never be saved from its own sense of grandiosity. Let's take a second to think about why a sweeping orchestral line doesn't work for this kind of song. Orchestral accompaniment in this usage is almost always meant to convey two things: a sense of scale and triumph. The Sound of Silence is a song about scale, but it's about feeling so impossibly small against the silencing world around you, not feeling so incredibly big that you can shout your message from the top of a mountain. I know I just talked about how bad those strings were, but honestly, I think the thing that you can see the biggest lapse of judgment in is the inclusion of orchestral percussion. There are these huge dramatic timpani rolls, sharp claps of cymbals, and even some steel bells thrown in for good measure. These sounds are so regal and so church-like, and they make no sense here. Are we supposed to feel like a tiny ant trapped in a repressive world that won't even let us speak our thoughts? Or are we supposed to feel like the conductor of a giant pit orchestra singing a great celebrational hymn? A fun thing you may notice about the original song is that it doesn't have any drums at all. Why? Because drums, at least in popular music, serve usually two functions: timekeeping and energy control. The riding guitar line covers the timekeeping. They honestly could have put in some light snare brushes or hi-hat taps to convey that feeling of repressed energy, but honestly, leaving something out of a piece of music that almost always has it in conveys to your ear that something is missing. There's this lack of moving energy or a beating heart. That is thoughtful atmosphere, not adding pit percussion because it sounds cool and epic. All of these elements come together to form music that is loud, loaded, and so full of its own sense of epicness that it loses any feeling of atmosphere and messaging. Instead of a quiet meditation on social repression and isolation, it's instead just a big, dumb blast of sound over lyrics that Disturbed thought sounded edgy. And speaking of lyrics, there is a whole nother can of worms to open when talking about David Draiman's vocal performance on this song.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
Let's get one thing straight. David Draiman is a talented vocalist. Stricken is such a fun song to sing along to because Draiman gives it such a powerful and energetic performance. However, his vocal style does not work for this song. Art Garfunkel's voice had a natural kind of meek and downtrodden tone that really emphasized that feeling of powerness and uncertainty. David Draiman sounds like a nu metal singer. From the very start, we hear problems. Draiman elects for this deep and breathy register at the bottom of his range for the first verse. This register isn't really full enough to go for that repressed feeling that I think it's going for, and he can't help but do these inflections that just make the lyrics harder to understand and feel a lot less poignant. Things get completely fucked by the time the third verse starts. If Draymond had just chosen a comfortable vocal register and tightened his performance up a little bit and carried that across the entire song instead of just the first 2 verses, it honestly wouldn't be that unlistenable. But from here on, he elects for an all-out belt. Don't get me wrong, he is certainly giving a strong performance here. But again, it is not right. I spent a long time earlier talking about atmosphere, but here the problem is context. The Sound of Silence is a song about metaphorically not being able to be heard. Not because you're not loud enough, but because the idea itself isn't possible. That's why those meek vocals tinged with fleeting hope and urgency work so well. The vocals lack power because the narrator doesn't have any more energy to give. Silence like a cancer grows. It's too powerful. Draymond, for whatever reason, decided he wanted to perform this song like he was the chosen warrior climbing to the top of a mountain to prepare his rebellious stance through the PA of a baseball stadium. It implies the feeling of forcing yourself to be heard because you have so much energy to give to get over the sound of silence. This triumphant and combative vocal style is just completely dissonant with the lyrics that give the picture of a land covered in thick fog. I genuinely cannot believe that somebody looked at the lyrics, but my words like silent raindrops fell and echoed in the wells of silence, and was like, yeah, let's get David to fucking scream over that. It'll sound so cool. The original song does have a bit of a sonic peak on the silent raindrops line, but the echoes in the well line is fully pulled back to bring back that feeling of losing hope. The Disturbed version simply goes way too far to have any sort of payoff like that. I think the last point I want to make is, and it's really funny thinking about a nu metal band doing this, is that Disturbed saw these lyrics in this performance and thought that this song was supposed to be an angry reaction to this cursed world around them when it's actually a sad reflection. If you think about it like that, I could see why you would go that direction with this cover. Except for the orchestral score. But that fundamental misunderstanding led them so many steps down the road to making one of the worst covers ever. Also, a cappella covers are usually bad too. If you've stuck with me through this entire thing, I really just want to say thanks. I know it kind of turned into a massive rant about Disturbed at the end there, but I hope you enjoyed my unhinged and heavily opinionated take on cover songs. As I said at the beginning, I'm really active on TikTok and Instagram, reviewing and recommending underground artists and doing shit posts as well. So if you're into that sort of thing, be sure to follow me on those platforms. This is the first long form video I've ever attempted. So if you liked what you saw, I would really appreciate it if you could like and subscribe. Lastly, I just want to say this is obviously all my opinion. So if you disagree with me on my take of any of these covers, be sure to tell me in the comments or drop your own that you think I should have talked about. Thanks for watching and keep on digging.